Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to get started here. Folks are going to continue to trickle in, but it's very nice to have all of you here. My name is Paul Formasano. I direct the Salazar Rio Grande del Norte Center here at Adams State University. And just wanted to say a couple of things before we get started here. This event is sponsored by the Salazar Center and the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable. Cassandra McCune, who is the vice chair of the Roundtable and also the education representative, is ill and unable to attend, but I'd like to acknowledge her help in planning this. I believe she's watching online. In a moment, I'm going to turn the time over to Amber Pacheco, who is the Deputy General Manager at the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, for the introductions of David and Bill, those that you've come to see. But before that, I just wanted to give just a very brief background about the Salazar Center and the Roundtable. And the Salazar Center was formed about 10 years ago, and its mission is to help increase awareness about water, land, and cultural issues here in the San Luis Valley. And tonight's activity is just part of one of those education initiatives. We also have a water studies minor here at the university, and we have Water 101 and 201 classes that run each fall and spring. We have some of the students from the current Water 201 class here. Water 101 will be starting in August. And the instructor, Maya, I think just walked in here somewhere, hiding in the back. This class is open to certainly Adams State students, high school students, and also community members. And we have some scholarship money to support those who would like to enroll in that. So it's a wonderful way to hear about what's happening in the valley and also hear from some of the experts as well. The Rio Grande Basin Roundtable is just one of 8 basin roundtables here in the state of Colorado, and it includes a wide range of stakeholders from agriculture, recreation, the environment, municipal interests as well. And they work together to fund water projects, and we're very fortunate here in the valley to have a very active group, and a group that is committed to collaboration and finding solutions to difficult challenges. So. Finally, I just want to remind everybody that after tonight's or this afternoon's presentation, we're having a reception over at Vista's Restaurant. That's located in that direction. It's on the 3rd floor of the football stadium. You can certainly walk over there. There's also a parking lot just to the, I believe, the east of that building. So that's open for everybody to come and enjoy and continue the conversation. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Amber to introduce our speakers.
Thank you all for being here today. It's a good crowd, and I know we have some folks online too, so thank you to those who are attending virtually. It's truly an honor for me to get to introduce these two gentlemen. I've worked with them now for 20 years, and they've really been committed to the valley and helping us with our water issues, and so I'm really glad that folks get to hear them talking about the history of the compact and some of the issues going on from them and not from all of us telling you the stories. First, I wanted to introduce Mr. David Robbins. He's been a committed friend and a colleague of mine now for 20 years. His work in the Valley began in 1975 at the Colorado Attorney General's office, where he represented the state engineer in a 1979 compact rules trial. And since 1980, David has served as the legal counsel for the Rio Grande Water Conservation District and continues in that role today. In his role, he's contributed to some major efforts, including the Closed Basin Project, San Luis Lakes, the Rio Grande Compact, Rio Grande Natural Area, the formation and operation of 6 groundwater management subdistricts, and our habitat conservation plan, just to name a few of the things that he's done with us. Mr. Bill Paddock began his work in the Valley around 1980 as an assistant attorney general. And he played a key role in the 1982 Ted Cook case in his time there with the state. In 1985, Bill began his career with his current law firm, where he represents the Rio Grande Water Users Association and many of its individual members in a wide array of water-related matters. So he helps a lot of the ditch companies and water user organizations around the San Luis Valley. Together, David and Bill, I would call them a pretty dynamic duo. There's a number of other folks who have been part of the team as well, but they've been involved in nearly every major water trial impacting the valley, notably the AWDI case, confined aquifer rules, Subdistrict Number 1's plans and the appeals to the Supreme Court, and the groundwater use rules. These efforts have required months in the courtroom and years of committed legal advocacy for the valley. Outside the courtroom, they've been instrumental in shaping legislative efforts that benefit all of us. These include the creation of the Great Sand Dunes National Park, the development of the Rio Grande Decision Support System, or the groundwater model, if folks know that, legislation authorizing the use of groundwater management subdistricts. David has also been vital in the passing of the federal Worth bill. That bill was critical in helping us to protect the valley from export schemes. And another of their accomplishments that I think is really a key one is they were part of the group that helped negotiate the Federal Reserve water rights, which is a unique and collaborative agreement that ensures that water continues to flow out of the forests for use in the valley, but protects the water up at the level of the forest. So a very unique case there. It's been a true privilege to work with both of these gentlemen. They've done a lot for the San Luis Valley. I'm grateful for all the wisdom that they've brought, their advocacy and their friendship, and I appreciate all they've done. And I wanted to let David and Bill both know that we're probably pretty sure that we're never going to let you retire. So with that, I'll let the two gentlemen start their presentation. Thank you. I'll pass that on to you, Bill.
Well, on the question of retirement, you're going to have to negotiate with my wife.
We'll send her some really nice gifts.
She's of mixed opinions on this. I always carry my purse here because it's got all the paper that I think I need and never use. Well, thank you, Amber, and thank you all for being here. It's really been one of the great joys of my life and my legal career to be able to work in the San Luis Valley. I love the people here, I love the place, and I've always greatly loved the work. Today, I'm been tasked to talk to you about something of the history of the Rio Grande Compact, Elephant Butte Reservoir, and its role in the compact. And I'm sort of a history buff, and I wanted to read you something that I think sort of sets the tone for me and sets the tone for basically water in the West. And this comes from a book by a man named Paul Horgren called The Great River. And it's probably the only and best true history of the settlement of the Rio Grande starting in the 1500s through the early 1900s. It's quite a tome, but it's fascinating. And it starts out, late one morning in April 1598, a party of 8 armed and mounted men came to the river from the south through heavy groves of cottonwoods. They were emaciated and wild with thirst. On seeing the water, they lost their wits. Men and horses alike threw themselves into it bodily. The men drank and drank in the river. They took water through their skins and cupped it into their mouths and swollen tongues and parched throats. When they could drink no more, they went to the dry banks and fell down upon the cool sand under the shade of the big trees. In their frenzied appetite for survival itself, they had become bloated and deformed, and they lay sprawled in excess and exhaustion. Their clothes were ragged, their boots were worn, their bellies were hungry, for they had come for 50 days through the desert with thorns, mountains with rocks, and nothing to eat but roots and weeds. For the last 5 days they had not had a drop of water. In finding the river, not only had they saved their lives, they had fulfilled their assignment to break a new trail to the Rio Grande del Norte from the south that would bypass the Junta de los Rios and bring the colony directly to the New Mexico Kingdom. These are the Spanish settlers that first arrived in what we now know as Juarez, and began sort of the saga of the eventual colonization and the European occupation of the Rio Grande Basin. Now, there were some fits and starts in that effort with the Mexican colonization and the Pueblo uprisings and the fights between the Spaniards and the Mexicans. But eventually the Spaniards, not the Mexicans, the Native Americans and the Pueblos, but eventually the Spaniards with their superior technologies had prevailed, and the settlement began through the Rio Grande Valley. By about, I guess 1875, 1880, the population of Juarez was on the order of 3,000. The population of El Paso was on the order of 300. And at that time, in the late 1870s, the Mexican government began complaining to the United States State Department about the loss of flows in the Rio Grande caused by upstream development in New Mexico and Texas. New Mexico and Colorado. As we all know, there was not much going on in the San Luis Valley until about the 1850s, when the original Spanish settlers settled in the south end of the valley. And the big era of canal building and the expansion of irrigation did not really get underway until the railroad reached the valley in the late 1870s. But at that point, through about 1888, you had a huge era of canal building and the effective full appropriation of most of the surface flows. At the same time, in New Mexico, the New Mexico Territory at the time, you had the big agricultural development, big in relative terms, in the Selden, Rincon, and Mesilla valleys. Well, we fortunately had a relatively wet period in the early 1880s, and so the complaints by the Mexican government sort of were tamped down because the water supply was adequate. But in the late 1880s, a drought again occurred, and you can see it in the history of the San Luis Valley as well, beginning about 1888. The big surge in canal building began to taper off because the surface flows simply weren't sufficient to supply more large canals. At this point, the Mexican government again started raising complaints about the reduction in flows at Juarez due to the upstream development. The complaints got pretty severe, and by the mid-1890s, the Mexican government was threatening to file suit against the United States in International Court of Claim, seeking $35 million in damages for the injury to the Mexican settlers in Juarez. The United States State Department was not entirely receptive to these complaints, and it was the opinion of the then Attorney General that the United States had no obligation to deliver any water to Mexico if it didn't want to, but the State Department was free to negotiate with them if they chose. The Secretary of State at that time chose to engage in negotiations with the Mexican government about water supplies in Juarez. And eventually they commissioned the International Boundary and Water Commission to perform a study of what would be the most appropriate remedy for the situation. And that study was heavily influenced by former Army general named Anson Mills, who was also a large real estate holder in the El Paso area. And he wanted to see a large reservoir built just upstream of El Paso, which would hold about 1.25 million acre feet and supply adequate water to the lands, irrigable lands in the El Paso area, and ample water to Juarez. So there was some momentum behind that proposal, but in 1902, the federal government adopted the Reclamation Act. And at that point, the Secretary of State asked the Reclamation Service to evaluate what would be the best way to supply water to New Mexico and to the farms in Texas and New Mexico. The Reclamation Service performed a study, and they said, well, the best site is at Elephant Butte, which is above the bulk of the irrigated lands in New Mexico. That site could hold 1.2 million acre feet. So that proposal was advanced both to Mexico, to the Republic of Mexico, and to the local irrigators. It found favor, but the problem was that by 1905, the United States had issued a permit for the use of public lands to the Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company, and it had proposed to build a reservoir slightly downstream of Elephant Butte Reservoir, and so it would have had a prior claim to the use of that water. That resulted in litigation over time with the federal government, and finally, by 1910, they canceled that permit for failure to prosecute, and that effort died. But one of the important features of the negotiations between the United States and Mexico was that in 1896, in order to allow the negotiations to go forward and to prevent further reservoir construction that might interfere with the negotiations, the United States issued an embargo on the use of public lands for the construction of reservoirs in the territory of New Mexico and Colorado. So no new reservoirs could be built anywhere on any public lands in those states. In 1904, there was something known as the International Irrigation Convention that was held in El Paso. And it was a group of course, irrigators from the West and representatives from Mexico. And at that point, the Reclamation Service presented its proposal for the construction of Elephant Butte Reservoir, a reservoir that they thought would hold about 2.2 million acre feet and could reliably supply about 700,000 acre feet a year for the irrigation of about 188,000 acres. Mexico didn't have any assurances of what water it would get out of that project, but at the end of the conference, everyone agreed that that would be the appropriate method to pursue to solve the water supply problems then existing in El Paso and Juarez. So by 1906, the federal government had authorized the construction of what is known as the Rio Grande Project. The Rio Grande Project includes Elephant Butte Reservoir, which is one built, had a capacity of about 2.2 million acre feet. And it also includes the downstream Caballo Reservoir, which has a capacity of roughly 300,000 acre feet. So you had, in total, approximately 2.5 million acre feet of storage under construction to supply the irrigated lands in New Mexico and Texas, and to provide 60,000 acre feet a year to Juarez at the Acequia Madre. And the 60,000 acre feet to Mexico was arrived at based on what their historical draft on the river had been before the times of shortage, and an estimate of the amount of water that would be necessary to serve their then irrigated lands. Well, the problem with the embargo on the use of federal lands is that in both New Mexico and Colorado, you couldn't build a reservoir. And by the late 1880s, all the reliable surface flows had gone. And as everyone knows, the water supply from the rivers doesn't parallel crop demand. And the reason you need reservoirs is to take the early spring flows that are in excess of crop demand save those in storage and deliver them later. This resulted in, I think, what we all are familiar with in Colorado is what's known as the practice of sub-irrigation. And sub-irrigation was practiced throughout the valley and had a special pronounced effects north of the valley and in the closed basin. And basically it amounted to taking every drop of water you could in the spring and using the aquifer as a storage reservoir in place of a surface reservoir so that the groundwater level would be high enough throughout the growing season to sustain your crops. And then at the end of the year, you could open up the drains and lower the groundwater levels. Sub-irrigation comes with a whole separate set of problems, as people know, including the subbing of agricultural lands. So over time, the lands on the east side of the valley, and particularly in the closed basin, had become so subbed out they were unfarmable. Now, in 1905, there was a slight relaxation in the embargo, which allowed reservoirs owners who could establish that they had initiated claims for the use of water prior to 1903 to complete the construction of their reservoirs. So this led to the completion of Smith Reservoir, Mountain Home, the Terrace Reservoir, Rio Grande Reservoir, Santa Maria Reservoir. But you couldn't have any more reservoir construction. There were other efforts throughout the period to obtain a relaxation of the embargo, and Colorado spent a lot of time banging on Congress and on the State Department and the Secretary of Interior to lessen the restraints of the embargo. And eventually the USGS was put in charge of evaluating these things, and they said, well, if you can show us that your storage does not adversely affect the water supply of the Rio Grande project, then we would consider allowing reservoir construction. That led to a number of studies that were done in the late 1910s, early 1920s in the valley on drainage, on the theory that if you drained the sub-irrigated lands and delivered that water back to the river, you could store an equivalent amount of water in a new reservoir. And this included what they called the sump drain, which would have been a large drain through the closed basin to lower the water in the sump area and deliver it back to the river. Tensions were also growing at that time between Colorado and New Mexico because New Mexico didn't want Colorado to be building any reservoirs or doing any more development because it could impact the water supply in New Mexico. Likewise, Texas was not particularly interested in any further development upstream because of its potential threat on the water supply for the Rio Grande project. So in the early 1920s, the tensions between New Mexico and Colorado were such that Congress suggested that the states ought to enter into compact negotiations. Colorado was willing to enter into negotiations with New Mexico, but didn't want to have anything to do with Texas. But ultimately, the calmer heads prevailed, and Texas was invited into the party. And the negotiations for the temporary Rio Grande Compact got underway in about 1925-26 timeframe. Simultaneously, a doctor from Pueblo named, I think it was Herman Woke, was appointed as the Secretary of Interior. And one of his early official acts was to rescind the embargo on the use of public lands in Colorado and New Mexico, so reservoir construction could go forward. And immediately, the proponents of the Vega Silvestre Reservoir, which would have held about 250,000 acre feet, obtained a permit and set about trying to figure out how to build that reservoir. At which point, New Mexico got rather exercised and threatened interstate litigation against Colorado if the construction of that reservoir began. Vega Silvestre is up on the Rio Grande. It's not Wagon Wheel Gap. It's not Wagon Wheel Gap. I think it's not on the South Fork. I don't know. I think it was on the South Fork. Anyway, so the Colorado didn't proceed with the Vega Silvestre Reservoir, and they did proceed with entering into the temporary compact or the compact negotiations with New Mexico and Texas in an effort to resolve the interstate dispute. And New Mexico's interest was protecting its water supply for its farmers. Texas's and the Reclamation Service's interest was in preserving the water supply for the Rio Grande project. But about the same time, the Middle Rio Grande project got underway in New Mexico, and that's Heron? El Vado, with a capacity of?
Was 180, well, 220 initially.
All right, to supply the Middle Rio Grande project, which prompted Texas to sue New Mexico over that project. The parties that did enter into a temporary compact in 1929, and the premise of the compact was that nobody would do anything to enlarge their use while they did a factual investigation, determine the basis for the compact and how we were going to allocate the water among the states. But central to that compact was also a clear statement that the federal government had imposed a burden on the states for the delivery of the 60,000 acre-feet to Mexico, and the states believed that that came directly from their entitlement to water, and that the federal government should be responsible for building the reservoirs and other structures necessary to offset that impact to the states. So the temporary compact called for the building of a state line reservoir for Colorado, right basically at the state line, filling up the canyon down there, and the construction of a drain from the closed basin to deliver that water to the river. The idea of the parties was that they'd collect data, and then by 1935 they would enter into a final compact. 1935 rolled around, and the states still were sort of at loggerheads and couldn't agree on the basic data about the river, at which point the federal government reimposed an embargo on the use of federal lands for irrigation or any other water development projects, again in New Mexico and Texas, and at the same time volunteered the resources of the Natural Resources Committee to do an investigation of the Rio Grande drainage to provide the factual information needed to form the basis of a compact. That study was completed and is known as the Rio Grande Joint Investigation. And it's a wonderful study. There are copies of it around. It's very long, and it has wonderful hand-drawn maps of the entire Rio Grande. And if you look at the map for the San Luis Valley, it's probably 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall. And you'll see the fences, you'll see the wells, you'll see what crops were being grown, where the ditches were. And it's a wonderful snapshot in time of what the early irrigation practices looked like, or not early, the mid-1930s irrigation practices in the valley looked like. But the fundamental conclusion of that study was that the water supply of the Rio Grande basin was only adequate to supply the existing levels of use in the states and meet the needs of the Rio Grande project. And the only excess water that would be available would be water that would otherwise spill from project storage, that is, be wasted out the lower end of the river. With this information, the states entered into compact negotiations, and by 1939 had agreed upon the Rio Grande Compact, which was then signed by Congress, or signed by the states, approved by the states, and approved by Congress, and went into effect in 1940. The Rio Grande Compact is really a mishmash of engineering principles and legal jargon, if you will. The core of the compact is designed to maintain the level of flows that existed during the compact study period, which was 1927 to 1935. And it's based for both New Mexico and Colorado on an inflow-outflow relationship. They looked at the flows of the Rio Grande at Del Norte and the flows of the Rio Grande at Labados, and they developed a table of relationships for any given amount of inflow, a certain amount of water has to be delivered to the state line. The same was done for the Caneyas. The Caneyas upper index includes the San Antonio and the Ortiz, no, Los Pinos at Ortiz, and the flows of those rivers April through October, plus the Caneyas at Magoti, and their delivery obligation is measured at Los Alces at its mouths on the Rio Grande. And the effect of these tables of relationships are they are consumptive use limiting. So as your inflow goes up, you may be able to take a little more water, but your delivery obligation goes up as well. So you're effectively limited in the total amount of consumptive use you can make, and for both rivers, it plateaus, and you just, even if you have more flow, you don't get to consume more water because your state line delivery obligation goes up proportionally. These delivery obligations and schedules, or we call them schedules of delivery, for the Rio Grande and for the Caneyas and for New Mexico, were intended to provide an adequate water supply for the Rio Grande project, which is basically the storage in Elephant Butte Reservoir and Caballo Reservoir. The combination of the two is referred to as project storage. The compact, while authorizing additional storage upstream in both Colorado and New Mexico, limits the use of that storage in some substantial ways. First, you can't store water in any reservoir in Colorado built after 1937. I'm sorry, 1939. Is that right? 37?
New Mexico's 29.
New Mexico's 29, Colorado's 37, I think. But anytime compact storage is below, not compact storage, project storage, I'm not sure what's wrong with my tongue today. It just, the wrong words keep popping off of it. Anytime project storage is lower than 400,000 acre feet, this is intended to ensure that upstream storage doesn't deplete the amount of water available. In addition, the compact has a system of credits and debits. And so to the extent a state delivers more water than its annual delivery schedule, it receives a credit for water in an Elephant Butte Reservoir. And if it underdelivers, it receives a debit. And the sum of your credits is your accrued credit, and your sum of your debits are your accrued debits. But it limits the amount of credits and debits that states can accrue. So in the case of Colorado, the compact says the accrued debit is limited to 100,000 acre feet. And in the case of New Mexico, 200,000, which prevents then the states from going into debt and depriving the project of water. That was the theory. That wasn't actually the practice, as we'll talk about here in a minute. The other thing that the project does, or the compact does, is it has a mechanism to allow upstream, the upstream storage of water spilled from Elephant Butte Reservoir. So to the extent that you have water in upstream storage and you have let's just say you have water in storage upstream and you also have an accrued credit or debit in Elephant Butte Reservoir. When Elephant Butte Reservoir spills, that is physically water runs out of the reservoir, then all credits and debits are eliminated. And this is one of the mechanisms by which the upstream states can benefit from their upstream storage. Now, Colorado and New Mexico both failed to meet their delivery obligations under the compact in the 1950s due to the drought. I think by 1966, Colorado's accrued debit, that is under delivery, was on the order of 940,000 acre feet. And New Mexico was over 500,000. And this was largely due probably to some mistakes in the underlying engineering about how severe droughts would be, but just to the severe drought that occurred in the 1950s and the lack of administration of surface water rights. So in 1966, Texas sued and New Mexico sued Colorado for its failure to meet its delivery obligations under the compact. While they had their foot on Colorado's throat, they graciously did not step down, and the states entered into a stipulation, and under that stipulation, Colorado had to agree to meet its schedule of deliveries every year without fail, without receiving credits for, without relying on credits and debits under the compact. So if the compact said you got to deliver 700,000 acre feet, you had to deliver 700,000 acre feet, or you'd be in violation of the stipulation. The bet of the downstream states was that Colorado was not going to be able to administer water sufficiently accurately to prevent substantial over-deliveries. And that was true. In the early years, Colorado did substantially over-deliver. And by, 1984, I think the accrued debit was down in the 400, 500,000 acre foot range. In 1984, one of the unique features of the compact came into effect, and it's known as debt reduction. The sum of the debts of Colorado and New Mexico were lower or greater than the unfilled capacity of Elephant Butte Reservoir. What that meant was even if the upstream states had fully repaid their debt, the reservoir would have been more than full. So the debt of Colorado and New Mexico was proportionally released to the amount by which it exceeded the storage in Elephant Butte Reservoir. And then, fortunately, in 1985, 1986, and 1987, Elephant Butte Reservoir spilled. And so the debits and credits of Colorado and New Mexico were eliminated. And that began the current era of administration where Colorado now can accrue credits and debits, although it tends to try not to do so, and restored it to the sort of position that it occupied at the beginning. But the fundamental point of all this is that the compact is structured to protect the water supply of the Rio Grande project and to limit the consumptive use of water in Colorado and in New Mexico based on the schedule of deliveries set forth in the compact. And the only way that you can get additional water is by basically storage, and that storage, if you store water and then you have a debt, you have to have water in storage equal to the amount of your debt so that the downstream states can call for the release of that water to bring the supply of Elephant Butte Reservoir back up to what is necessary to make the full irrigation demand or the full irrigation supply or as nearly as possible. That in Colorado creates an intrastate problem because we really don't have any significant post-compact storage other than Plateau Reservoir. And the Rio Grande and the Conneaus River have separate delivery schedules. So if the Rio Grande substantially underdelivers and there is water in Platura Reservoir, that could basically prevent the water users on the Caneyas from using the water in Magoti Reservoir and stir up all kinds of hard feelings like we dealt with when we're trying to sort out how the compact actually worked among the basins. I don't think they have quite the same problem in New Mexico. You sort of have the Middle Rio Grande project there, and it's a similar problem. The Middle Rio Grande, if they're under-delivered, the burden falls on others. So, in sort of in a nutshell, that's why we all are always looking at what's happening down at Elephant Butte Reservoir, because it is in some sense, the tail that wags the dog on the Rio Grande, and the compact is structured to ensure that the water supply for the project is protected against new developments upstream. And as we see in the past 20, 25 years declining water supplies, this has made the burden much greater because the total storage in Elephant Butte Reservoir is, for much of the time, below 400,000 acre feet, which prevents any upstream storage in any new reservoirs. So it's been, it makes the administration that much more difficult and further restricts the water supplies on the river. So I guess in the big sense, that's how the system works. And I'd be happy to go into more detail if you can stand the pain or answer any questions you might have. Rolf.
Yeah, well, so, Bill, thank you. I just wanted to ask and see how Colorado looks at the 1929 condition above the index gauges, and so people will understand that when the negotiators were looking at Elephant Butte and protecting it, they weren't just looking at the valley bottom areas, they were actually looking above these index gauges also. And in New Mexico, we have a very large area that's subject to the 1929 condition and essentially not modifying depletions in that area. Colorado has that also on the main stem, and just thought it'd be worthwhile bringing that up.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even call it the 1929 condition. I'd just call it the condition that's baked into the engineering, because it looks at the upper indexes and says, what is the flow? And then the compact contains a provision that allows a relocation or adjustment of the upstream index stations to account for new depletions that occur above those indexes, which would then basically increase the measured flow at the index by the amount of the depletion upstream, so that you would get an accurate measurement of how much water should be being passed through and delivered to the downstream states.
But if you did that, the people in the middle would have to use less, because the Lovato still has to be kept whole. I guess that's the...
Well, the people in the middle would, here it would be governed by the priority system.
Right.
And if there were upstream juniors who were taking more water, in theory, in theory, the division engineer would go up and shut them off and take his handcuffs up there and his whip. And he'd take him out by the river and flog him and then chain him to a head gate and say, don't open that anymore. Or at least that's the way they used to do it. I think Craig's a little nicer than that, but yeah. All right. Any other questions? Eric.
Bill, what's the rationale behind the spill wiping out credits and debits? Is that just sort of a continuation of the natural proportional reduction that you had talked about when you've got more storage than Elephant Butte has?
I think it's just a reflection of the fact that the Elephant Butte Reservoir is full and has an adequate supply, and the notion that the upstream debits were going to be limited to a certain amount, and you could either have credit water or debits in there, but the debits held by the upstream states were to be used to fill project storage. So I think the rationale was, once project storage is full, you can save in your upstream reservoirs the water you have saved as debit water, because otherwise some or all of it would have spilled from the reservoir. Yeah, and if you had credit water, it was lost anyway. And there is a provision for relinquishing of credit water early, but if you do relinquish it in lieu of a spill, it's treated as a spill. So, Bob, Judge Ogburn, I'm sorry, Your Honor.
We had spills also in 94 and 95.
Yeah, I think there were.
Have we had any spills since then?
No, we came close in 99, didn't we, Craig? Came very close in 99, but nothing since then. The first spill, I believe, was in 41 and 42, and the reservoir spilled a lot then didn't spill again until 85. So you had a huge period in there where it didn't spill. Then you had a lot of spills in the wet period of the 80s. The 90s was a comparatively flush water period, and I think you had the spills in 94, 95, or 95 and 96. One of those, we had a tussle with Texas because it appeared to both Colorado and New Mexico that they had been liberal with their early releases to avoid a spill, and that was ultimately reconciled. Yeah.
What's this about Mexico owes Rio Grande water? What's that all about?
That's under the 1946, is it 46? 44 treaty between the United States and Mexico on both the Colorado and the lower Rio Grande. And under that treaty, there are certain reservoirs in Mexico that are supposed to deliver water to the United States. And for drought and other reasons, Mexico has failed to make those deliveries, which has caused a good deal of hardship in the lower Rio Grande. But that's under the 1944 treaty. All right, David.
Great job. Hello, everybody. Couple of things in response to the last question. There are two treaties that we pay attention to on the Rio Grande. One is the Convention of 1906, which allocated 60,000 acre feet to Juarez, and the portion of Mexico above Fort Quitman. Fort Quitman's 75 or 100 miles southeast of El Paso. The 1944 treaty was obviously signed during World War II. There were obviously a lot of complicated international issues going on at the time, but what it did was it gave Mexico 1.5 million acre feet out of the Colorado, and it allocated a bunch of water to South Texas below Divisadero, below Great Bend. But that water was all to come out of the Conchos system, which rises in Chihuahua State, straight south of El Paso, basically. And as Bill described, the thing that you've been reading about with the president refusing to deliver water on the Colorado, that was simply a response by the United States State Department to the refusal of Mexico to deliver the amount of water on the Conchos that they were obligated to deliver, which has created enormous problems in the area around Brownsville. So that's the intertie there. It really doesn't affect us and our treaty, or our compact, or the 1906 convention. If you want to know how Pancho Villa got into the U.S. all the time, he crossed the river below Fort Quitman, where it has been dry for centuries. He didn't have, if you saw a movie that had Pancho Villa swimming the river, that was baloney. Okay, compacts, just to be sure we're all clear, compacts are authorized by Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution. They are the mechanism by which the framers of our Constitution concluded that states could resolve differences of opinion over matters of sovereignty. Because when the 13 states formed the Constitution, they were all sovereigns. They weren't part of anything. And they had tried to have the Articles of Confederation where they kept their sovereignty. And it didn't work at all. And the Constitution is a point at which sovereign states gave up their authority to the federal government and gave up portions of their sovereignty to a common sovereign, but they retained others. And that's what compacts are designed to do, to resolve differences over matters of common sovereignty, water being one of them. And so the Rio Grande Compact is a very significant document. To the extent any of you have been told or have harbored the idea, well, if it doesn't work that well, we'll just change it. Now, that isn't how life works. The people in New Mexico and Texas are just as fond of whatever rights they obtained as we are either fond of our rights or aggravated by our obligations. But the Supreme Court has said compacts are contracts. And we all know from our private lives, people don't get to change contracts just for the hell of it. Both parties have to, or all parties to a contract, have to agree to the change. And if one party says, well, I don't like it, and the other two say, we do like it, you're kind of stuck with it. And that's how this all works. Bill gave you a wonderful, wonderful historical tutorial about why we have the Rio Grande Compact and how it came about. In our Article 3 of this compact are the tables of relationship that Bill referred to. And just so you know, the Conejos River is obligated to deliver a wide span of the flow at Magoti. It goes from zero delivery, no delivery at all, at the lowest flows, to 68% of the flow at Magoti under the highest conditions. The Rio Grande at Del Norte has to deliver 30% of whatever is at Del Norte, but its upper limit, after you go down the curve, is 60% of the flow at Del Norte. And as Bill told you, the whole purpose of this is to limit the amount of water consumed by all purposes within the San Luis Valley to the benefit of Colorado and to protect the water supply available both to New Mexico and to the Rio Grande project, which provides water to southern New Mexico and Texas. I'm going to put my glasses on now because I have notes, different than Mr. Paddock. I've been asked to comment on the Closed Basin project. Folks, the Closed Basin project was, or a drain project, effectively equivalent, was first talked about in the 1920s. It has been talked about continuously from the 1920s until it was constructed in the 1980s. The Closed Basin project, the state of Colorado, the citizens of the San Luis Valley, and the citizens of northern New Mexico were furious. I can't overstate how mad everyone was when they were embargoed from using federal land to develop additional water supply features for their economy. And the embargoes that were placed on them by the federal government, only to have the federal government turn around and by international treaty give 60,000 acre feet to Mexico. You can't imagine how pissed off people were. And so we spent 40 years lobbying to obtain federally funded features that would add to the water supply available to the irrigators in the San Luis Valley. And it was a constant, continuing drumbeat. And when you look at the Closed Basin Project, what is the first obligation when the project is constructed? The first 60,000 acre feet go to the compact at no cost to this state. 60,000 acre feet. Does that ring a bell from Mr. Paddock's comments to you? Of course, it's the 60,000 acre feet they took from your forebears and gave to Mexico. Do you understand how this worked? Okay? So let's not ever, as far as the Closed Basin is concerned, say, oh, that project had no purpose, it's a boondoggle, it's a scam. Well, it wasn't. It was designed to replace to Colorado irrigators and water users the 60,000. And that's why Congress said it will have no cost to Colorado or the irrigators. Only after the 60,000 per year is allocated and 5,300 acre feet per year are allocated to the wildlife refuges, is there water available? And if that water is produced at that point in time, the irrigators are responsible for paying for extra water beyond that, subject to their ability to pay. It doesn't say in the legislation that they have to pay whatever it costs to produce the water. It doesn't say they have to repay the project. They have to pay whatever the Bureau determines represents their ability to pay. But so far, the most that project has been able to produce because of climatic variability, that's my PC moment for the day, because of climate variability, the max that is produced is 41, 42,000 acre feet, nowhere close to 60,000 acre feet. So the project is constructed and will be maintained by the Bureau of Reclamation for the benefit of the state of Colorado and its obligations, which you all bear, to the downstream states. So I want to be clear, the Closed Basin Project was contemplated in the 1930s when the study that Bill described for you occurred. It is contemplated in the compact itself. The Closed Basin is specifically called out in the compact definitions, and it is contemplated in federal legislation. The purpose of the Closed Basin Project isn't to do anything other than manage the water table. That's really all it's supposed to be doing, and that's, as far as I know, is exactly how it's being run today. Okay. You can all ask me questions when I finish the rest of what Paul has assigned me. But everybody remember, I may not always be right, but I'm never in doubt, and I'm perfectly happy to go at it with anyone who wants to. I realized I should tell you one other thing. I am absolutely terribly allergic to junipers, pinyons, cedars, scrub oak, and wheatgrass, all of which have made my life hell every spring in the San Luis Valley for 50 years, and they still do. So if I cry and snivel and stuff, it's not because of all of you or the questions, it's because I can't help it. So, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, on the South Platte River, there were lots of irrigation wells. And they generally belong to a replacement group called GASP, the Groundwater Appropriators of the South Platte. And instead of doing an augmentation plan, what they did was manage the river through conjunctive use. They had wells at ditch head gates, they rented reservoir water, and what they did for 30 years was they scratched the itch. Whoever needed water got water in exchange for not demanding that the wells be shut off. Now, it helped that, just as in this valley, most of the senior surface water right owners also had wells for a variety of reasons. But it worked slick. It was not decreed. There were no court requirements. It existed because of the state engineer and his willingness to, as he understood it at the time, to use temporary yearly replacements. And I'll get around to why we have subdistricts. But in 2002, terrible drought all over the state, and there was no water to start to prime the pump, to start fixing the depletions as they were visited upon the river because of well pumping in that year and in prior years. And as a result, the GASP scheme program over the next year or two collapsed. And the Supreme Court in Simpson v. Bijou basically said, you can't do this anymore. They have to do augmentation plans. They have to have formal replacement water for every shortage that might be visited upon the South Platte. And the consequence of that was literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres went out of production, and dozens upon dozens of farm operations went into bankruptcy. And in the San Luis Valley, we had operated with the assumption that, first of all, the wells north of the hydraulic divide in the closed basin had minimal, if any, impact upon the Rio Grande. Number two, that because of the complex hydrogeology of the San Luis Valley, there were not definable impacts for the pumping of a particular well on the river. And so we just proceeded along. The wells pumped, as Bill described it, when we agreed in 1968 to meet the compact each and every year in exchange for not being dragged through the mud by our neighbors. And so the division engineer would curtail pre-compact water rights and require them to send a portion of their diversions downstream so that we were sure that we met our obligation at the state line to New Mexico. So the leaders of your community in the early 2000s looked up at the South Platte, looked at what was happening, and said, we can't do that in the San Luis Valley. We've got to get ahead of the state coming in here and shutting our wells down and stopping all of the conjunctive use operations that have been so successful that lock out, in effect, the ability to use the aquifer systems of the San Luis Valley to replace the reservoirs that we were denied back in the 20s and 30s. And we have to do something to take responsibility for ourselves. And so Ray Wright Doug Shriver were significant leaders in this effort. There were many more. But, they said to the Rio Grande Water Conservation District Board, we need help. And I got thrown into the mix. But what we concluded was that the Rio Grande statute permitted the development of something that this legislature calls subdistricts. It had never been used before, but that seemed to me and to us and to the people I worked with on the legal side, Bill, David Harrison, and others, that might offer these leaders of the valley a way to go if they were willing to do the work. And outdriven mostly by a desire not to have happen to the San Luis Valley what happened to the South Platte when conjunctive use models were found to be outside of the umbrella of Colorado law. They set about trying to set up a subdistrict. They realized that trying to do it on a valley-wide basis, they were historically astute enough to know that anything you try to do on a valley-wide basis can be extraordinarily difficult, if not doomed, simply because of historic jealousies, differences in communities, difference in churches, in ethnicities, in school districts, that there were people who, if a person from Stanford said they wanted to do something, there was somebody, up in center who would say, by God, he spit in my shoe in the football game in 62, screw him. I'm not gonna ever support that. And so they realized that they needed to do subdistricts in a way that allowed communities of interest to work together to try to accomplish something for that community in a way that the community would find acceptable. And rightly or wrongly, the area with the largest well concentration was the area north of the Rio Grande and north of what we called the hydraulic divide. And so that's where they headed. Setting up subdistricts, you only had two ways to do it under the statute. One, you could have petitions signed by 50% of the landowners controlling 50% of the land. So basically you had to have the owners of at least half the land, and you had to have half of the owners. The second advantage that they saw was that you didn't have to have a vote of the general public. This could be defined as a vote that occurred, or a petition that occurred for a class of use, being, in this case, irrigated land, irrigated with wells. And they eventually gathered sufficient petitions. We had court hearings on it, and ultimately the water court approved the petition, and subdistrict number 1 was formed. Now, you can, this is, I told Paul beforehand, this is really an unfair setup, because normally you get a podium that when the gleam comes into the eye and the tomatoes come out, the speaker can get behind. And so in any regard. The problem with Subdistrict 1, and it's my fault, and I am sorry about it every day, is that a lot of people who didn't want to be involved in protecting, restoring, and sustaining the aquifers were dragged in because you only needed 51%. And so that subdistrict is a cohesive area defined legally, and everybody who has an irrigation well inside it is part of the program. All of the other subdistricts in the valley were formed by people who wanted to solve the problem, signing up their land. The statute doesn't require there be contiguity. And so we call those checkerboard subdistricts. They're much easier to manage. They get people who sign contracts that say, we will agree to reduce our pumping if it is determined that everything else we're doing isn't working. That's not true in Subdistrict 1. Subdistrict 1 is a pure economic model. It is just set up to raise money and use that money to buy out or acquire wells, well pumping land that is formally irrigated to reduce the total draw in the system. We have an obligation in this valley. First of all, we overran the rabbit by the 1980s because the state engineer in the 60s and 70s believed that the water north of the hydraulic divide was effectively isolated from the Rio Grande. The state issued all sorts of well permits. So there is land being irrigated out in the closed basin that never saw any water before a well was drilled. And there are enough acres now in the valley between surface water and groundwater that we are consuming more water than Mother Nature is giving us. And we have no choice, valley-wide, but to reduce in a rational way through the subdistrict controlled by all of you to reduce how much consumption is occurring. Now, the genius of this program is that the people who are basically shooting themselves in the foot are given an opportunity to point the gun somewhere else. They don't have to do that. They can work together to reduce the total consumption so we can match between surface water and groundwater use what Mother Nature is giving us every year. And that to me is it's terrible if you're out there working as a producer to have to confront the fact that you may not be able to run the end gun onto the county road just like your dad did. But the fact is that they provide us with an opportunity to look one another in the eye and say, we've got to change some of the things that we are doing in agriculture to reduce the total amount of consumption that is occurring in our basin so that Craig's job gets markedly easier. Because the tables of relationship, this is the Rio Grande Compact. I work on every compact Colorado has. Well, that's not true. I don't work on the Animas La Plata Compact. But all the rest of them, this is, the Rio Grande Compact is genius. Because if there's no snow, there's no runoff, there's no flow at Magoti, and there's no flow at Del Norte, so we don't owe anything. And if we can get in balance with those two tables so that we're consuming what we are entitled to consume, but not more, then he doesn't have to curtail senior surface water rights, because the whole system will work the way the framers in the 30s understood it would work. I want to scream at you about one other thing. Half of the people in this room sort of say to themselves, well, you know, how did we get this screwed up? You know, those people 30 or 40 years ago were dumb. Why didn't they understand all of this? And I'll tell you the reason. It's pretty simple. We didn't have groundwater models in 1975. The groundwater model in the 60s and 70s was from here to the wall long. It was made out of plywood. There were nodes that were where resistors and capacitors were stuck onto the plywood, and they were all hooked together with wires. And if you had too much water going out the bottom on this end of the plywood, you went back up the line and changed with a soldering gun and snips, changed all the resistors and capacitors. That's how they tried to figure out what the impact of wells were on the surface system. And we think it's, you know, it's easy to do. It's not. You know, we have the Rio Grande Decision Support System that has 6 layers, covers all of the wetted part of the valley, and you know, has it's a half a mile square cells, 6 deep, and we can do it mathematically now. When I tried the first case that used a model, Bill 2, there weren't laptops, folks. And you had Sun Microsystems made something that wasn't as big as Big Blue, but it was pretty big. And in order to run the model that we first had back in the late 70s and early 80s, it took a couple of those all linked together just to begin to understand groundwater flow in the valley. So I beg you, you know, be charitable for you know, those who went before you, because they had none of the tools that you have today. And they had to deal with the very same complex system of groundwater and surface water interaction that you are fortunate to be able to try to manage with huge computing power and lots of capacity to check people out. Now let me quick look at my notes. Okay. At the end of the day, the whole purpose of the sub-districts, the whole purpose of using whatever the closed basin project produces, which you know is now in the 5,000-6,000 acre foot per year range, is to try to figure out how the residents of this valley can obtain the maximum amount of water usable under the constraints imposed by our compact. The whole effort that the state engineer's office and Craig's office are engaged in is to squeeze every drop of water they can get out for you to use beneficially while still meeting the compact obligation. So there's only one way to do that. You can have whatever thoughts, dreams, thinks that you care to have. Water is just inflow, outflow. There's a certain amount that comes in, and there's a certain amount that goes out. There's no way to make water in the middle, and it's just a water budget. You look at all your inflows and you look at all your outflows, and you get a certain amount to consume, and that's all. That's what sustainability means. That's the byword for us all. Pardon me, my nose is running. God, I love allergies. So, I don't have anything more to say. I'll just start to ramble. Don't like to do that, and I know you hate it, so. Questions? And I'd like to get Bill up here too, because he actually knows what he's talking about. Mike?
We know that what we're doing is not achieving what we need to achieve. So what's the next step we're going to have to take?
All right. Mike asked, Mike, for those of you who didn't hear, he said, we know what we're doing is not achieving what we need to achieve. What's the next step? First of all, let me just say that we can't focus only on Subdistrict 1. The other 5 subdistricts, plus Trinchera subdistrict, which is set up under the Conservancy District Act, not the Conservation District Act. The Castilla County is not in the Rio Grande Water Conservation District boundary. They're mostly close to, if not achieving sustainability with what they're doing now, okay? So we shouldn't look down at our shoes and say, oh God, we're screwed. We should appreciate the fact that particularly in the areas of the valley that depend upon confined aquifer wells, not the area in Subdistrict 1 where you have the large, unconfined, shallow aquifer that is depended upon, they're doing fine, and they're very close to sustainability. They're very close to matching how much water Mother Nature's giving them with how much they're consuming. Thumbs up. That's a victory for the whole valley. We have a real problem north of the river in Subdistrict 1. The source of the problem is not the residents of that subdistrict. It's not their farming practices. What it is an absolute collapse of inflow into that part of the valley. I mean, speaking personally, I was very naive when we went through this whole process of trying to figure out how to achieve sustainability. I assumed that we would see rational crop prices that would actually go up and then come down and go up and come down, which historically incentivized producers to reduce the number of fields they were growing or change their crop types in response to market forces, that sort of stuff. Well, that hasn't happened. You know, by and large, commodity prices have been pretty damn good throughout this whole period. Most importantly, we haven't had an average or above average year in years. We're in the middle of a terrible, either climate variability that's pretty long term or a terribly long drought. But we based our thinking on the fact that, yep, there was a drought in the 50s. Yep, there was a drought in the 70s. Yep, there was a drought in 2002. And everything will be okay. We'll have wet periods. Since 2002, we haven't had a wet period. And what did the National Weather Service do that helps us believe that things are okay? They dropped the 80s off the 30-year projection that they used to tell you whether you're average or not, right? So we're average, except we're average about 50,000 acre feet shorter than we were 5 years ago. So it's, there are a whole series of problems here that we have to deal with, but the biggest problem that we have to deal with in all 6, 7 subdistricts is there isn't any inflow. There hasn't been, where does the water come from that theoretically the closed basin project was supposed to capture? Well, it was historically had come off the East Range. We haven't had an average or above average year on the East Range with one exception in 30 years. And why are we surprised that the closed basin project can't pump 60,000 acre feet a year? If it doesn't snow, there's no water for anybody to salvage. Oh, and while I'm on this, there's been a lot of thought over the last 50 years about how to protect the San Luis Valley from the demands outside of the valley. Part of that has to do with allocating what is available in the system here to the benefit of the citizens of the valley. Having a national park, having a wildlife refuge where the Baca was, having the Forest Service claiming all of the water on the forest, with us agreeing, yes, sir, we want you to have all of the dam reserve rights you want. I mean, there was shock throughout the West when the San Luis Valley said, oh yeah, take it. Why? Because the Forest Service can't do anything with it. It just runs down, and where does it end up? In the San Luis Valley, where it's available for use by all of you. So the closed basin project, you don't have to love it, but you have to understand that if there's extra water that builds up in the sump, who's currently in line to take it and put it in the river so it can be brought back into the San Luis, into the agricultural areas north and south of the Rio Grande? The closed basin project. Otherwise, it sits out there and provides a target on all of you, because there's now more water in the system that doesn't have a priority or doesn't have a claim to it. Why would you do that? I mean, why does that make any sense to anybody in this room? When right now you got a recycle system. Whatever goes in the river gets to be used again by all of you. So, okay. Ask me a question, maybe it'll piss me off and I can really rage. Eric.
Pissed you off enough that you didn't answer it. You raged against climatic conditions, but the question remains, in Subdistrict 1, what do we do?
We have the same choice we have everywhere else in the valley. You have to reduce the amount of consumption that is occurring until it matches the amount of water you have coming in, both naturally and through the ditches. I hate that. I can't stand it, but that's the truth. I mean, this is a huge banking operation, right? You have Mother Nature deposits every year, and we have withdrawals. Natural ET, crop ET, obligations to our neighbors to the south. We add up the last three, and it has to match the first one. Otherwise, you're just asking the bank to give you money that you didn't put in the account in the first place. And that pisses bankers off. And it should piss all of you off. Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the people in the sub-district, the board of managers, the local people who have been put on the board, they believe that they have to push things to an inflow, outflow operation. And that's what they're proposing. That's the amended plan, plan number 4. And it has to, if it is fully implemented, it has to work because you can't take any more out than you put in. So that's a neutral. Mike?
I was gonna say, when does that occur?
Well, it occurs as soon as we can wend our way through the water court and defend the plan against those who don't agree. More questions? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Okay, so, up in Swatch County, you know, our Swatch Creek water users and our San Luis Creek water users feel the closed basin is just sucking the water out from under.
I know that's what they think,
I know,
but
I'm just saying, well, to finish my question, but they are, you know, they're like first in time, you know, they were the early settlers of the valley, and they have, you know, not, the South notwithstanding, and they are, you know, these are brand new well users who are, you know, who are usurping their water, and they have to shut off, and the wells just keep going and going. And I just wonder
well,
what we can do for that situation.
I spend my time looking at the stuff that the scientists give me. The groundwater contour maps. Groundwater works just like surface water does. It flows from the high point to the low point. And it's very hard to come up with a way that the closed basin project is taking water when the contours flatten out outside of the project. They don't on the east side. They come down off the Sangres and into the project boundary. But the water from the project is either to the north, flat, so it's not flowing into the project, or they go further to the west where non-closed basin wells are operating. And that's all part of the 2 or 3 or 4 lawsuits that are ongoing now, which is how does all of that get sorted out. But I understand, in my reading of things, and I'm perfectly happy to be proven wrong, the amount of water that is said to be drained out of Saguache Creek and San Luis Creek doesn't match with the hydrology and the groundwater contours as they are currently reported. So
We are drilling wells and trying to add to the model to show that this is occurring.
that's great. More data is perfect. I'm 100%. Folks, facts are, the only thing that we end up having to live with are the facts. And finding more information, more data, so that we make better decisions. That's the whole deal. Sometimes it proves that what you thought was true is not in fact true. Sometimes it proves that what everybody thought is wrong, at which point we all have to be intellectually agile enough to change our position and not worry about it. Because at the end of the day, Mother Nature's going to force us to live with the facts no matter what they are. So, yes, other questions? Sir, I promised you.
Well, there's people online who I don't think can hear, so.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, this may be changing the subject a little bit. Maybe Bill would be better to
That's
answer
good.
this.
I would love any chance to give him the microphone.
Yeah. This has to do with Elephant Butte and the 400,000 acre foot cutoff. And seems like we're at that now. What happens if we're there and we stay there? You know, is that, what happens with credits and debits at that point?
Well, we're going to stay at 400 or below until we get some rain or some snow. I mean, that's just driven by hydrology.
It doesn't affect credits and debits, it affects upstream storage. And so you can accrue a credit, or you can have a debit. The only time you accrue a credit is when you over-deliver, and Craig screwed it up when we take him back and flog him. And we under-deliver just to piss off New Mexico and remind them we have the authority to do so. But other than that, 400,000 is the limit on upstream storage in post-compact reservoirs. And so it prohibits that, and it doesn't give you the ability to capture water otherwise. You might have a credit and you may have some water in storage. You can give up a credit and exchange it for upstream storage.
It has a big hit on New Mexico upstream of Elephant Butte. Yeah, these years.
Ralph's going to cry for New Mexico for us.
So yeah, and I know Holland from way back. But yeah, I think 400,000 acre feet right now has more in effect within the upper Rio Grande of New Mexico and into the middle Rio Grande Valley than up here. Yeah, because El Vado Reservoir, which is the main conservation storage for the middle Rio Grande, little Santa Fe reservoirs that supply the city of Santa Fe, they're restricted in their storage. They cannot store, period, under these circumstances. I won't get into the details of relinquishment. But.
I want you to fix that because my son lives in Santa Fe and needs a shower.
And it is very punitive to us to have to abide by that 400,000 because it really limits. And in New Mexico, I didn't talk about this, but they extracted from the federal government all sorts of dams, reservoirs, all through their system. What did we get? We didn't get any. We got the Closed Basin Project. And we got a reservoir built in the 60s on the Caneos at Platoro. But that was it. I do want to be sure that we're clear that the State Line Reservoir, there was a withdrawal to protect the ability to build that until the natural area legislation passed. And it was the demand of the federal government, which was ultimately conceded, was that the footprint for the State Line Reservoir be eliminated from the federal withdrawal register. So that was the trade-off in order to get legislation that said there would not be a wild and scenic river below Alamosa. And so just make a mental note. Other questions of either me or Bill? Yes, Pat.
You and Bill have worked for decades to try to preserve farming and ranching in the San Luis Valley. Had a conversation with a man in the know recently, and I asked him about the significance of the San Luis Valley, 400,000 irrigated acres. Is it important? Is it important to Colorado? Is it important to the United States? Bill and David, I'm concerned that the San Luis Valley is going to be an endangered species.
Well, it's only an endangered species if you all decide it is. Man, for Lord's sake, you can all stand up straight and pull your shoulders back. There's not a fight we can't win. Of course, there's 60, 70,000 people here. It's not that big a deal. On the other hand, we have water rights. We have productive agriculture. We have communities. You only give that stuff up if you want to. It's up to you. It's not up to me, certainly. Bill and I we have the war horse out back, and we'll jump up on it and grab the lance and go off in any direction you tell us. But there's absolutely no reason to assume that the San Luis Valley is anything more today than it was 75 years ago and will be 75 years from now. I can guarantee you that if you decide that taking a little money now in exchange for some of your water to go out of the valley will probably be the decision that does create the problem that Pat's talking about. Because I always look to the Owens Valley, a very dry agricultural valley on the east side of the Sierra Nevada in 1900, and by 1935 or 40, it was back to being a complete desert. And all of the water went through the pipe, even though Los Angeles Department of Water and Power said, oh, they were only going to take a little. There isn't any water left for local use except that which the Department of Water and Power gives to cities like Bishop to allow them to remain. And if you've ever been to Bishop, it is purely guide shops. You know, if you want to go climb Mount Whitney, you have to go to Bishop. But that's about it. There's certainly no agriculture. And there's certainly no steamboats on Owens Lake, which was at one point the second largest lake in California, after Tulare Lake, which doesn't exist either. They're both gone. So, but that, you know, that's up to you folks. I mean, it's your community. It's, you know, it's everything to you. Rio?
Thank you. Yeah, I may, based on what you just said, David, for folks that didn't attend the symposium, there was a great presentation there about the value of water for the San Luis Valley, produced by American Rivers and a lot of local people involved in. It may be, I can't really place it in the timeline the way you did with the early groundwater studies. It might be in the, you know, an early study trying to quantify all this. But what you said, if we give up our water now for a little bit of money compared to what the value of water that's identified in that study is for the long term, I mean, it's worth hanging on and doing everything we can to keep it. I mean, that value is infinitely more than what we might sell it for today, in my view. So I recommend that. It's on the Salazar Center playlist on YouTube. You can watch that presentation, and it's online too.
And you'll need I'm sort of conflicted, I have to admit that. You'll need a lot more lawyers than Bill and me and Eric in here when you get to fighting over the money. Because once you start trading water, which is good for generations, for money, which is only good for as long as somebody can keep it in their pocket, you're going to produce a societal disaster for yourselves, in my humble opinion. More questions for Bill, too. I mean, the bottom line is this, that people have been thinking about the future of this valley for 150 years. And they have all gotten you to this point with all your water, weathering droughts, weathering times of too much water, and giving you the opportunity to continue on. And it is really incumbent upon you all to pick up the sword and continue to try to figure out how we make do with the amount of water we have available to us. Leroy.
I'm a lot more optimistic now than I was even 8 or 10 years ago because of the way the sub-districts are working. Even in our own sub-district, I'm president of Sub-District 3, and this morning one of the well owners came in and he has a number of wells. And we had gone over the historical pumping of those wells from 2009 to 2015, and we compared them for this individual with the pumping that we have seen from 2017 to last year. And he has reduced by almost 40%.
Yes?
Okay. There's some people have reduced, and they're doing it by changing out crops, doing conservation. So many people, changed their nozzling. They've changed the way they manage the water during the season. And to be honest with you, I'm pretty optimistic in our own sub-district anyway. We know we've, from 2009 when we started well metering until 2024, we have had an average water use of 31,000 acre feet. If you look at the last 6 years, we're a little less than 26,000 acre feet. And we know we need to bring that down to 24,000 average to be able to start bringing that aquifer back up. And so that's just another little increment. And I'm sure it's going to happen.
Yep,
So,
I agree.
just a thought.
Craig, you stand up and yell if I'm wrong, but I think the pumpers the people with wells in Subdistrict 1 have done the same. I think their reductions are at least 40%. Amber, is it closer to 50? 40%. So they have, up in Subdistrict 1, they have reduced their pumping by 40%. And we have not seen much recovery in the groundwater system. So I want to take you back to one of my screeches earlier. It's all about Mother Nature. In the 1980s, Ralph Curtis and I went to the CWCB, the State Water Board, and got $500,000, which was a lot of money then, to hire drag lines to pull open the drains that existed headed toward the sump. There was so much water in Subdistrict 1 that the tractors were stuck in the fields. There was water everywhere. Many of the drains had been farmed over, and we went in, we had the rights of way, we went in with drag lines and pulled them open again, just to drain the water out of the area around center, out to the east and into the sump. So it only takes 3 or 4 years of 300% of normal snowpack, and there's water everywhere. And that's what we had in the 80s, right? That's what we had, all up and down the system. In New Mexico and Colorado, everywhere. There was just water everywhere. We haven't seen that since. We all get very excited when we see average. That's the best we've done. We haven't seen anything like 200, much less 300% of average. So, yes, ma'am.
I wonder if there is an opportunity to keep some water in the sub-district fallowed land so that we can keep roots in the ground and so that we don't create a dust bowl here. And when the sub-districts, when you fallow land in a sub-district, you just go to zero, right? And
Well,
it may not be a
no,
question for you, but I just a question for anybody here.
No, we're not, that's not exactly correct. I mean, we are working very hard not to do just sort of dead, dry it out and let the wind take the whole thing. The Rio Grande District staff, Amber and her staff, are very aware of the need to have cover. And it's all part of the water budget. I mean, if it's important to ensure that you maintain a cover that isn't just kochia weeds, you can afford to put a little water into that. You don't have to just, it's not black and white on and off. I mean, some people may choose to do that, but that's certainly not the choice of the district or the district board. Because that's a problem all over the state. What else? I know the drinks are waiting. Be sure you go to this cocktail party and reception over at the field. And the reason is because every third year we host the Rio Grande Compact Commission for its annual meeting, which is tomorrow. So there, in addition to Rolf, there will be people from New Mexico and Texas who come to this meeting, and when we go to Santa Fe or El Paso, people come who are water users, and they're very social and very kind to people from Colorado. And even if you're only there for a little while, going over and just shaking hands and telling them they're welcome. And we have absolutely zero snow. It's now at 40%, and what we see, that's the kind of baloney you'll put up with. You know, let our water go, and which you smile and say, it's a 40% snowpack. We hope you understand what that means. Because this basin, right, different than the Colorado, you all and your neighbors in New Mexico and Texas have come to figure out that if there's no water, there's nothing to fight about. So you might as well figure out how to get the most out of it that all three states can without going to the newspapers and without acting like butts to the people in the other states. Just every day get up and read about the Colorado and say to yourselves, we're not going to do that. If we think something's wrong, we're going to call up our friends in New Mexico and Texas who we met at the cocktail party and say, I heard this, is it true? And they'll probably say no. And, you know, that helps us all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So again, there is food over at Vistas. The Caneos, San Luis Valley, and Rio Grande water districts are providing that. There's a cash bar. So follow the crowd, enjoy some food and drink, and more conversation. Thank you.